Hello everyone and welcome back to the garage. Today I'm going to start working on the Daytona again. It's been a long time. When I started this project, if I'd known it's going to take me this long to actually finish it, I wouldn't have believed it, but yeah, here we are. So in this video I want to sort out the front end. I'm going to replace the headstock bearings, replace the fork seals and new oil, replace the wheel bearings, new brake discs as well. And by the end of this video I also want to have the lights back on, the instruments, new grips, and probably a few other small things. So I've actually changed my mind. While editing this video I realized I'm either going to cut out a lot of details and have it pretty shallow, or I'm going to have a very long video. So I've decided to split the front end section of this bike. I'm going to split it in 3, maybe 4 videos. So this is the first video on the front end, and I'm just going to replace the headstock bearings, and in the next video I'm going to rebuild the forks. So I got this far and I just realized I completely forgot to explain why I'm replacing the headstock bearings. So you probably aren't going to notice it on camera, but as you turn this, it was a bit more noticeable with all the weight on it, the forks and everything. But as I get to about here, there was just a slight little notch. It's barely noticeable now without any weight on it, but it was there. So what I was thinking is probably as it was sitting, because it's usually right in the middle where you ride it most. If you have some play and you ride a lot straight, most of the time you ride straight, that's where you get a little indent. But this is slightly to one side, so I was thinking maybe it was just sitting on a side stand in that position and maybe moisture or something got in and corroded the bearings. I don't know, we'll find out when we look inside. So since I'm doing this much work to the bike, it didn't make sense to leave these bearings here with that slight notch. So yeah, that's why I'm replacing them. So let's continue. So now I'm just loosening the nut that holds the bottom yoke in place and preloads the 2 bearings. And once that's off, the bottom yoke just falls out. So here we are, I've got the fork clamp off. There it is. It's some dried up grease. I don't think this is factory. It's probably been replaced before. But look at that bearing and look at that race. Here's where you can see the damage. So it's a good thing me and the owner of this bike, Chris, have decided to replace these bearings. That does not look good. And if I just go back to the clamp here, don't know if you noticed, but we've got a problem. Noticed it yet? So these bearings are supposed to have a seal on the underneath, and this one is missing it. So someone has definitely been here before. This wouldn't have left the factory like that. But without that seal, there's nothing stopping all the moisture and road dirt and everything getting into that bearing and killing it, which is probably what happened. So yeah, not looking good, but it's a good thing we're replacing them, so let's continue. So I'm just going to pull the outer race of the bearing out now. You could use a long drift from the top, but I don't have one, so I'm going to use this blind bearing puller instead. Should work just as well. Screw the slide hammer onto it. And it slipped once. Twice. But it worked just fine the third time. The top bearing is a deep groove ball bearing rather than a tapered roller bearing like the one on the bottom, and the bore in the frame isn't as tight, so it comes out with one hit. So I'm just going to give everything a good clean. And yes, that's my wife's toothbrush again, and I think she's starting to catch on, but don't worry, I'm going to clean it this time before I put it back. And I'm ready to install the outer race for the bottom bearing. I'm just going to grease it lightly so it slides in easier, and also for some rust protection. And I'm going to use my bearing and seal driver to drive it in. First I'm going to do it with the flat back of the disc until the race is flush with the frame. And then I'm going to flip it over with the tapered side and drive it in the rest of the way. The top bearing again is not very tight, so it only needs a few taps to go in, and also it sits slightly proud of the frame when it's fully seated. Now there is a puller to get the inner race of the bearing off the shelf, but I don't have one, so I've just gripped the bottom yoke with some soft jaws in the vise. And I'm going to use a chisel and a hammer to break the bearing cage off. And then use that shoulder to slowly drive the race off. Now I've given everything a good clean, and I'm just going to grab a blob of grease and pack the new bearing as good as I can to make sure it's all filled. And also apply some grease to the bottom yoke shaft. Then I'm just going to put the new seal in place. Very important, don't forget about it. Next comes the new bearing, making sure it's in the right orientation. And on top of it, I'm going to place the inner race of the old bearing upside down with the narrow part facing the new bearing. So I've got something to hit against. So I'm just going to gently tap it until I feel it's engaged and lined up. And then I'm going to flip it over and place it on my vise so I can hit it properly until the bearing's fully seated. And now I'm just going to apply a bit more grease to the top and bottom bearings. And slide the bottom yoke in. And once that's in place, I'm going to thread the nut back on. Now this nut is not supposed to be really tight. It's just meant there to preload the bottom bearing and take out any play. It's going to be locked in place by the top yoke and top nut, so it does not need to be tight. But I'm going to begin by tightening it quite hard to make sure the bearings are compressed and seated, grease is squeezed out and all that. So I'm not going to try and adjust it and later on get some more play out of somewhere. So I tighten it pretty hard, loosen it up again, and then just tighten it slowly until I take out all the backlash and I'm left with a nice smooth running bearing. And once I'm happy with that, I can put the top yoke back in place and secure it with the top nut. I'm not going to tighten that yet, however, because I need the forks to be in place to line everything up. Now that's it, we're done with this step. If you want to see more in this series of videos, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.